I live in a small town where everyone knows each other. My neighbor, Jack, was a quiet guy who mostly kept to himself. He didn't talk much, but he wasn't unfriendly, just reserved. We'd nod at each other when passing by, but that was about it. Jack was a big hiker and often went off into the woods on weekends. He seemed to know every trail and hidden path. One Saturday morning, I decided to go for a hike myself. I had a tough week and needed to get out. I wasn't looking for anything too challenging, just a walk on a familiar trail that loops around a small mountain. As I was about to leave, I saw Jack heading out with his backpack and gear. He gave me a brief nod, and I nodded back. I started my hike about half an hour later. The air was cool, and the trees were showing the first signs of fall. The trail was quiet, with only the sound of my footsteps and an occasional bird. I enjoyed the peace as I walked up the mountain. After a couple of hours, I came to a fork in the trail. One path went back down, and the other was an older, less used trail I hadn't tried before. On a whim, I decided to take the less traveled route. The trail quickly became rough, with bushes and fallen branches covering the path. I had to be careful not to trip. It was clear that not many people used this trail anymore. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. The birds and insects seemed to vanish. The silence was unsettling, but I was curious to see where the trail led. After about an hour, I started to feel uneasy. The trail twisted further into the woods, and I wasn't sure if it would loop back to the main path. I stopped to catch my breath and check my surroundings. That's when I saw something off to the side of the trail. At first, I thought it was a large rock, but as I got closer, I realized it was Jack's backpack. It was lying on the ground, partly hidden by bushes. I called out, but there was no answer. A cold sweat formed on my neck. Jack wasn't the type to leave his gear behind. I looked around, trying to figure out where he might have gone, but there was no sign of him. The woods were completely silent. My sense of dread grew. Something felt wrong. I decided to head back to the main trail, but as I turned around, I saw something that made my heart race. There were footprints in the dirt, not far from where Jack's backpack was. They were deep, like someone had been running, and there was another set, larger, following his, as if someone had been chasing him. Panic set in. I moved quickly back down the trail, my eyes scanning for any sign of people or danger. Every sound made me jump. Every rustle of leaves felt like it could be someone or something watching me. The deeper I went, the more frantic I became. It felt like the forest was closing in around me. When I finally reached the main trail, I didn't stop. I ran to the parking lot where my car was, fumbling with my keys, and sped away. I haven't seen Jack since that day. His house is empty, his car still in the driveway. No one in town has heard from him. People say he probably moved, but I don't believe that. Jack wouldn't just leave without saying anything, especially not without his gear. Sometimes, late at night, I think about those footprints. The way they followed Jack's, like something hunting him. I wonder what happened to him in those woods. More than anything, I worry if whatever was chasing him might come back. And if it does, will it come for me next? The thought that something might be out there, waiting for its next victim, keeps me up at night. I decided to go for a hike on a trail I'd never tried before. It was a warm, sunny day, perfect for a walk in nature. The trail started out easy, with wide paths and clear signs, but as I went deeper into the forest, the path got narrower and harder to follow. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches blocking out the sunlight, making the path darker. After about an hour, I noticed the signs were gone. The path itself was hard to see, covered in leaves and small branches. I thought about turning back, but I was curious to see where the trail led. I kept going, pushing through thick bushes as the air grew cooler and the sun started to go down. Eventually, I came to a point where the trail split in two. Neither path had signs, and both looked like they hadn't been used in a long time. I picked the one on the right, hoping it would lead back to the main trail. As I walked, I noticed the forest had gotten strangely quiet. The usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves were gone, replaced by a heavy silence. The only sound was my footsteps on the ground. The path began to slope down, and the ground became rocky and uneven. I stumbled a few times, catching myself on nearby trees. The further I went, the steeper it got, until I was almost sliding down the trail. I tried to stop and turn back, but the ground was too loose, and I kept slipping forward. Panic set in as I realized I was getting deeper into the forest, farther from help. Finally, I reached the bottom of the slope and found myself in a small clearing. There was no sign of a trail, just thick trees all around. The sky was getting darker, and I knew I needed to find a way out before nightfall. I looked around the clearing, searching for any sign of the path I had been on, but there was nothing. I was completely lost. I started walking in the direction I thought I had come from, hoping to find the slope and climb back up. But every way I tried seemed to lead me deeper into the forest. The trees were thick, their branches scratching against my arms and face as I pushed through them. I was breathing hard, my heart pounding in my chest. Hours passed, and night started to settle in. I tried to stay calm, telling myself I just needed to keep moving, but the fear was growing stronger. I knew I had to find some place to stay for the night. I found a large tree with thick roots that made a sort of small space at the base. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. I crawled into the small space, pulling my jacket tight around me, trying to stay warm as the temperature dropped. The night was long and filled with strange noises. The forest, once quiet, now seemed alive with movement. I could hear things moving through the bushes, the crack of sticks, and the rustling of leaves. I forced myself to stay still, too scared to check out the sounds. I just wanted the sun to rise, to bring light and some hope of finding my way out. When morning finally came, I crawled out from under the tree, stiff and cold. I started walking again, trying to keep the rising sun on my left as a guide. Hours passed, and I still couldn't find my way out. My throat was dry, and my legs ached from all the walking. I kept pushing forward, even though each step felt heavier than the last. Just when I thought I couldn't go any further, I heard the faint sound of running water. I followed the noise, moving as fast as I could. I came upon a small stream, the clear water rushing over smooth rocks. I dropped to my knees and drank deeply, the cold water giving me just enough strength to keep going. I decided to follow the stream, hoping it would lead to something, a road, a campsite, anything. The stream wound through the forest, and I followed it, my hopes slowly fading as the day went on. But then, as the sun began to set again, I saw something through the trees, a building barely visible in the fading light. I hurried toward it, my heart racing. As I got closer, I realized it was an old, abandoned cabin. The roof had partly caved in, and the walls were covered in moss and vines. But it was shelter, and I knew I had to take my chances. I pushed open the door, which creaked loudly, and stepped inside. The inside was dark and smelled old, the floor covered in dirt and broken bits of wood. I found a corner that seemed cleaner and sat down, my back against the wall. I was exhausted, too tired to worry about anything else. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the fear that still gripped me. As I sat there, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. The creak of a floorboard, not far from where I was sitting. I held my breath, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound came again, closer this time. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do, but I was frozen in place. Then I saw it, a faint movement in the darkness. Something was in the cabin with me. I could barely make it out, just a shadowy figure moving slowly toward me. I wanted to run, to scream, but I couldn't move. The figure stopped a few feet away, and I could feel its eyes on me, watching me. We stayed like that for what felt like forever, me too scared to move, it too still to be human. Then, without a sound, it turned and disappeared into the darkness, leaving me alone once more. The next morning, I found the strength to leave the cabin. I followed the stream again, walking for what felt like days until I finally stumbled upon a dirt road. I had no idea where I was, but it didn't matter. I had made it out. But as I stood on that dirt road, I realized something terrifying. Whatever had been in the cabin with me, it hadn't just left me. It had let me go. It knew I was lost, knew I'd been out there for hours, alone, and it didn't need to follow me anymore. It was still out there, waiting for the next person to lose their way, for the next lost soul to wander into its woods. I had been planning the hike for weeks. It was supposed to be a simple day hike, just a quick break from the usual routine. I wanted to clear my mind. The trail was supposed to be easy to follow, leading up to a small hill with a view of the forest around it. I started early to avoid the afternoon heat, and the first part of the hike went smoothly. The trail was well marked, and I made good time, enjoying the sounds of nature around me. But as I got higher, the trail started to get less clear. What began as a wide dirt path turned into a narrow, rocky trail that was hard to follow. At first, I didn't think much of it. I had a map and plenty of supplies, so I wasn't worried. But the farther I went, the less the trail looked like the one on the map. I must have taken a wrong turn somewhere, but I couldn't figure out where. I kept walking, hoping to find some sign or marker that I was on the right path. The trees got thicker, and the sunlight barely made it through the leaves. It felt like the woods were closing in on me. I started to feel uneasy, but I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. The map showed a clearing up ahead, so I kept going. After another hour of hiking, I still hadn't found the clearing. The trail had vanished completely, and I was surrounded by thick forest on all sides. Panic started to creep in. I tried to retrace my steps, but the woods all looked the same, and I couldn't find the trail I had been on. It felt like the forest had swallowed it up. I kept moving, hoping to find the trail again, but every step seemed to take me deeper into the wilderness. I knew I had to stay calm, so I stopped to think. I had a compass, so I decided to head in the general direction of where I started. As long as I kept moving, I thought I'd eventually find my way back. But the forest seemed to twist and turn around me, and no matter which way I went, I couldn't find anything that looked familiar. The sun was getting lower, and the shadows in the trees were getting longer. I had no choice but to keep moving, but I was tired and hungry, and my nerves were starting to fray. As the sun went down, I realized I was completely lost. My compass was still pointing me in the right direction, but the ground was getting rougher, and I had to climb over fallen trees and squeeze between rocks. The forest felt endless, like it was playing tricks on me, keeping me from finding my way out. I kept hiking even after dark, but the forest was pitch black, and I could only see a few feet in front of me with my flashlight. The sounds of the woods at night were unsettling, and every rustle of leaves made me jump. I knew I couldn't keep this up forever. I needed to find a place to wait for morning. Finally, after what felt like hours, I found a small, flat spot surrounded by trees. It wasn't much, but it was the best I was going to find. I set up my emergency blanket and huddled under it, trying to stay warm as the night grew colder. My thoughts were racing, and sleep was impossible. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, though I knew it was just my fear playing tricks on me. The night dragged on, and by the time the first light of dawn crept through the trees, I was exhausted. But I knew I had to keep moving. With no sign of the trail, I picked a direction and started walking, hoping against hope that I'd find my way out. Hours passed, and I was starting to lose hope. My legs were weak, my mouth was dry, and every step was a struggle. But then, in the distance, I heard something, a faint hum. It was different from the usual forest sounds, something mechanical. I forced myself to move faster, following the sound until I broke through the trees and stumbled onto a dirt road. Relief washed over me. The road meant people, help, and safety. I had no idea where I was, but it didn't matter. I followed the road, and after what felt like an eternity, I saw a small cabin in the distance. I made it there and collapsed on the porch, too tired to care about anything but the fact that I was finally safe. Later, when I had recovered and managed to get help, I found out I had wandered miles off the trail. Somehow, I had gotten completely turned around in the thick forest and ended up in a completely different part of the woods. I was lucky to have found that road. If I hadn't, I might still be out there, lost in the wilderness with no way out. Now, every time I think about that hike, I can't shake the feeling that something was off about those woods. It felt like they were trying to keep me there, pulling me deeper and deeper until I couldn't find my way out. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't found that road, but I'm not eager to find out. And the strangest thing, even when I was safe, back in that cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had never really left those woods. The trees, the darkness, the feeling of being watched. It followed me. And sometimes, even now, I wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, sure that I'm still out there, lost in those endless, twisting woods. I set out for a solo hike in a remote area I had never been to before. The starting point of the trail was quiet, and the forest seemed peaceful. I carried only the basics: water, snacks, a map, and a compass. The weather was great, and I felt excited about exploring these new woods. As I walked deeper into the forest, the path became harder to follow. The trees got thicker, and the sunlight barely made it through the leaves. I checked my map and compass often, but nothing seemed to match up. I thought maybe I was just turned around, so I kept going. Hours passed, and I couldn't find the trail at all. My map was useless now. I took a break to eat, but I started to feel uneasy. The forest was unnervingly silent. Even the usual bird songs had stopped. I decided to head back, but the forest felt like it was closing in on me. Every direction looked the same. I started to panic as my sense of direction failed me. I retraced my steps, hoping to find any sign of the path I had taken. My heart raced as I realized how lost I was. The sun was setting, casting long shadows that made the forest seem even more frightening. Just as it was getting dark, I found an old, run-down cabin. It was covered in moss and looked like it hadn't been used for years. I hesitated but decided it was better than being out in the dark. I carefully approached the cabin and opened the creaky door. Inside, it was dusty and filled with cobwebs. There was no sign of anyone having been there recently. I spent the night in the cabin trying to stay calm. The silence was unsettling, and every little noise outside made me jump. By morning, I felt more alert and determined to find my way back. I knew I needed to get out of the forest before my supplies ran out. Using the compass and the rising sun to guide me, I navigated through the forest. After what felt like an eternity, I finally emerged back at the trailhead, exhausted and relieved. As I looked back at the forest, a chilling thought struck me. What if I wasn't alone out there? I had seen no signs of other hikers or anyone at all. It was as if the forest itself was hiding something. The experience made me realize how easy it is to get lost and how important it is to be prepared. But what I'll never forget is that uneasy feeling that I wasn't entirely alone, and the eerie silence that fell over the woods as I tried to find my way out. It left me wondering if something else was watching, waiting in the shadows of those trees. My friend and I decided to go for a hike in a nearby forest. It was a last-minute idea, something to do on a Saturday just to get out of the house. The weather was perfect, slightly cloudy but not too cold. We grabbed some water and snacks, and by mid-morning, we were on the trail. The forest was quiet, with only the sound of our footsteps on the leaves and the occasional bird chirping. The path was clear, and we walked without really thinking, enjoying the fresh air and the smell of pine trees. We weren't serious hikers, just two guys looking for something to do, so we didn't even bring a map. The trail seemed easy to follow. After a couple of hours, we reached a small open space. We decided to take a break, so we sat on some rocks and had a drink. The forest felt still, almost too still. The clouds were thicker, blocking most of the sunlight, and the shadows in the trees seemed darker. I felt a bit uneasy, but I pushed it aside. We'd been walking for a while, and my legs were tired. That was probably why. After a few minutes, we got up and started walking again. The trail kept going through the trees, but it started getting narrower. The more we walked, the more overgrown it became, and soon it felt like we were barely on a trail at all. We thought it was just a part of the path that people didn't use as much. It happens, right? We didn't worry too much and kept moving. The deeper we went, the more the forest seemed to close in around us. The trees grew thicker, and their branches blocked out most of the light. I started to notice that the sounds in the forest had changed. The birds had gone quiet, and the wind that had been rustling the leaves earlier was gone. All I could hear was our footsteps and our breathing, which seemed too loud in the silence. Then we noticed something strange. The trail, which had been faint but there, just stopped. There was no clear way forward, just a wall of trees and thick bushes. We hadn't seen any turns or other paths, so how could the trail just end? We stood there for a moment, trying to figure out what to do next. My unease grew stronger, a tight knot forming in my stomach. We decided to turn back, but as we retraced our steps, nothing looked familiar. The trees, the rocks, everything seemed different. We kept walking, but it felt like we were going in circles. My heart started to race, and I could see the same worry in my friend's eyes. We were lost. We began to walk faster, hoping to find something that looked familiar, but the forest seemed to change around us, like it was hiding the way out. The clouds above were thicker now, making it darker than it should have been. We tried to stay calm, but the feeling that something was watching us, something just out of sight, gnawed at me. After what felt like hours of wandering, we stumbled upon a small stream. Relief washed over me. Water meant a way out, right? We followed the stream, hoping it would lead us back to town. But the more we walked, the more twisted and strange the trees around us became. Their trunks bent at weird angles, roots clawing out of the ground like bony fingers. The stream itself seemed off, its water too dark, too still. Eventually, we came across something that made my blood run cold. A single, worn-out shoe lying on the edge of the stream, half buried in the mud. There was no sign of who it belonged to, no tracks, nothing. Just the shoe. I stared at it, my mind racing with all the bad things that could have happened. Each thought was worse than the last. My friend didn't say anything, but I knew he was thinking the same thing. We didn't touch the shoe. We just kept moving, faster now, driven by a growing fear. The stream led us to another open space, but it wasn't the relief we had hoped for. In the middle of the clearing stood an old, worn-down sign, its wooden surface worn smooth by time. The words on it were hard to read, but I could make out one word, danger. We stood there, staring at the sign, not knowing what to do next. The forest around us felt alive, like it was breathing, waiting. That's when it hit me we might never get out. The forest wasn't just a place. It was something else, something that didn't want us to leave. As the daylight started to fade, we realized we were running out of time. We had no choice but to keep moving, but deep down, I knew we were already trapped. The forest had us, and it wasn't going to let us go. We kept walking, pushing through the thickening darkness, but it didn't matter. The forest had changed, and so had we. The feeling of being watched was stronger now, almost like there were eyes all around us, just waiting for the right moment. We were no longer just two guys on a hike. We were prey, and the forest was the hunter. In that moment, I knew we weren't going to find our way back. The darkness was closing in, and the forest had swallowed us whole. There was no escape. All that was left was the cold, creeping realization that we were never getting out of there alive. The sun was setting when my stepbrother and I started our hike. We picked a trail that promised nice views and a little adventure. The trailhead had a wooden sign that was partly hidden by thick bushes. It looked inviting enough, so we pushed through the overgrown plants and began our walk. As we continued, the forest seemed to close in around us. The trees grew taller, and their branches twisted together above, blocking out most of the light. The deeper we went, the quieter it got. The usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves faded into a creepy silence. It felt unsettling, but I tried to ignore it and keep my eyes on the trail. About an hour into the hike, I noticed something strange. The trail was getting narrower, and the plants were becoming thicker. It felt like we were straying from the main path, though I couldn't remember seeing any forks or signs that we had gone off track. My stepbrother, always positive, told me we were fine and that the trail was probably just less maintained. Suddenly, we came across a small clearing with an old, run-down cabin. It was barely standing, its roof sagging and walls covered in vines. It looked abandoned, but something about it gave me a bad feeling. We got closer out of curiosity, and that's when I saw something even stranger. The door was slightly open, and there were fresh footprints in the dirt leading to it. My stepbrother wanted to go inside the cabin, but I was uneasy. I had a strong feeling that something was wrong. Reluctantly, we decided to keep going on the trail instead of exploring the cabin. As we turned to leave, I heard a noise behind us, a twig snapping. My heart raced, and I looked back, but there was no one there. I tried to brush it off, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. The trail got even more confusing. What was supposed to be a loop turned into a maze of twists and turns, and soon we were completely lost. The sun had fully set, and darkness took over the forest. The trees, now dark shapes against the black sky, seemed to press in on us more. We tried using our phones for directions, but there was no signal. Panic started to set in. I remembered the cabin and suggested we try to find it again, hoping it might offer some shelter or at least help us figure out where we were. We retraced our steps as best we could, but the forest looked different in the dark. Every shadow seemed to move and watch us. When we finally reached the clearing again, the cabin was gone. The spot where it had stood was now empty, with no trace of the building or the footprints we had seen. My stepbrother was as shocked as I was. We searched the area frantically, but there was nothing to find. Desperate, we followed the only path we could see, which led us down a steep slope. We stumbled through the dark, tired and scared. After what felt like hours, we finally made it to a road. We flagged down a car and got a ride back to safety. The whole experience left me deeply unsettled. The cabin had vanished without a trace, and the forest seemed to have played tricks on us. As I lay in bed that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching us from the shadows. The forest was still, but I kept hearing faint noises, like whispers or footsteps, that would stop the moment I tried to listen closely. I couldn't explain what happened, but I knew one thing for sure. Some places hold secrets better left untouched. The hike had turned into a nightmare, and the thought that something might still be out there, waiting in the darkness, made it hard to sleep. My sister and I decided to go hiking in the mountains on a trail we hadn't tried before. It was a sunny day, and the forest around us was full of life. We followed the trail signs, the path winding through thick trees and up steep hills. Felt nice to be out in the fresh air, just the two of us, away from everything. The trail got harder as we climbed. The trees got closer together, and the sunlight barely made it through the branches. The air felt colder, and the sounds of birds and bugs started to fade away. We kept going, but the path seemed to get narrower and more covered with weeds with every step. After what felt like forever, we reached an open space. It was a strange spot, with an old rusty car half buried in the dirt. The car was covered in moss, and the windows were broken. It looked like it had been there for years. There was no road leading to it, just trees and bushes. It didn't make any sense, but we didn't think too much about it. We were tired and just wanted to keep moving. We kept following the trail, but something felt wrong. The path seemed to twist and turn in ways that didn't make sense. We started seeing things we had already passed. Rocks, trees, even that old car, but from different angles. It was like we were going in circles without knowing it. The sun started to go down, and the forest got darker. My sister and I began to worry. We were deep in the woods, and it was getting late. The trail signs had disappeared, and every direction looked the same. We tried to find our way back, but the more we tried to retrace our steps, the more confused we got. Night fell, and the cold crept in. We didn't have enough stuff to camp out. We used our flashlights, but they barely cut through the thick darkness. The trees seemed to close in on us, and every rustle in the bushes made us jump. It felt like we weren't alone, but we never saw or heard anyone else. Hours passed, but it felt like days. We kept walking, hoping to find the trail again, but it was no use. We were lost, really lost. The fear of spending the night in the woods started to sink in, and I could see the same fear in my sister's eyes. Then, in the distance, we saw a dim light. It wasn't bright, but it was enough to get our attention. We hurried toward it, hoping it was another hiker or a campsite. But as we got closer, the light didn't get any brighter. Instead, it flickered like a candle. We found ourselves back at the open space with the old car. The light was coming from inside it, a small, weak flame that made no sense. There was no one around, just that strange light in the car. Felt wrong, like something we shouldn't have found. We didn't stick around to figure it out. We turned and ran back the way we came, hoping to get away from whatever we had stumbled upon. But no matter how far we ran, we kept ending up back at that car. The light never moved, just flickered in the dark. By the time the sun rose, we were worn out, but we had finally found the original trail. We made our way back down the mountain, not saying a word to each other, just focused on getting out of the woods. When we finally reached our car, we didn't look back. I still don't know what happened that night. We never spoke about it again. But every time I think about hiking, I remember that old car, the light that shouldn't have been there, and the way the woods twisted and trapped us. I haven't been back on a trail since, and to be honest, I don't think we ever left that forest. Something about the way those trees looked at us as we ran. They weren't just trees. They were watching, waiting for us to come back. And I know they'll be there if we ever do.